Annabelle gripped the worn leather seat as the train lurched violently, her knuckles white against the dark upholstery. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on steel had become an erratic percussion of disaster. Through the frost-etched window, she glimpsed towering pines whipping past in a blur, their snow-laden branches reaching like desperate fingers toward the careening locomotive. The locket pressed against her chest beneath her traveling dress, the only thing left of her family, the only anchor to a life that had crumbled like autumn leaves. Sarah's face smiled up from the tiny daguerreotype inside, frozen in time before the fever took her, before their parents followed her into the cold ground. The locket held more than memories. It held the last whispered words of her dying mother. Find the truth in Blackridge, child. The answers. They're waiting. But now, as the train careened toward what felt like certain death, those words seemed like the fevered ramblings of a dying woman. Annabelle had sold everything: her parents' farm, her mother's jewelry, even her father's treasured books to buy passage west. She'd had nowhere else to go, no one left to turn to. The letter from a distant cousin in Colorado had seemed like providence. Come to Blackridge. There's work here, and we take care of our own. The car tilted at an impossible angle. Screams erupted from the passengers around her. A well-dressed man 3 seats ahead turned in his seat, his pale eyes finding hers across the chaos. Something in his gaze made her blood freeze, not fear, but recognition. He knew her. But how she'd never seen him before in her life. Before she could process this revelation, the world exploded. The train car bucked like a wild horse, throwing passengers against windows and walls. Annabelle's head struck the window frame with a sickening crack. Stars burst behind her eyelids as the acrid smell of smoke filled her nostrils. When her vision cleared, orange flames were already licking at the far end of the car. The mysterious passenger was gone, vanished as if he'd never existed. Panic seized the survivors. A woman in a blue dress sobbed hysterically, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. An elderly man tried to push open the main door, but it was jammed shut by twisted metal. The flames crept closer, consuming everything in their path with ruthless hunger. Annabelle's seat had been thrown sideways, pinning her leg beneath a heavy wooden beam. She pushed against it, her muscles straining, but it wouldn't budge. The smoke was getting thicker, burning her lungs with each breath. Around her, the cries of the trapped and injured filled the air. A young mother clutched her infant, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. Please, she begged no one in particular. Please, someone help us. Annabelle looked up at the window above her head. The glass was cracked but intact. If she could break it, she might be able to squeeze through, but first she had to free herself. The flames were only 20 feet away now and closing fast, drawing on strength she didn't know she possessed. Annabelle braced her back against the seat and pushed with both legs. The beam shifted slightly. She pushed again, ignoring the sharp pain shooting through her trapped limb. This time it moved enough for her to slip free. She grabbed her small carpet bag and looked around desperately. The window was her only chance, but it was high above her head. She dragged a broken seat over, climbed onto it, and used her bag to smash the glass. Shards rained down, cutting her hands, but she didn't stop until she'd cleared enough space to crawl through. As she pulled herself up, she heard a voice behind her, weak, desperate. Miss, please. She turned to see the young mother, still holding her baby, trapped beneath fallen luggage. Their eyes met across the smoke-filled car. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then the flames reached her, and Annabelle had to look away. She tumbled through the window into the snow-covered mountainside, her body rolling down the steep embankment. Rocks and brambles tore at her clothes, but she was alive. Behind her, the train car exploded in a ball of orange fire, taking with it everyone she hadn't been able to save. Annabelle lay in the snow, her body racked with sobs. The image of the young mother's final moments burned in her mind like a brand. She pressed the locket against her chest and whispered a prayer for the dead, for the innocent lives lost in what should have been a simple journey west. When she finally stood, her legs shaking with shock and cold, she saw the lights of a town twinkling in the valley below. Blackridge, the place her mother had told her to find. But as she stumbled through the snow toward those distant lights, she couldn't shake the memory of the mysterious passenger's pale eyes or the terrible certainty that this was no accident. The town of Blackridge squatted in the valley like a predator waiting to strike. Even from a distance, Annabelle could sense something wrong with the place, a darkness that went deeper than the mountain shadows. The buildings hunched together as if seeking protection from some unseen threat, their windows glowing yellow in the bitter night like watchful eyes. Snow crunched beneath her feet as she made her way down the winding path. Her traveling dress, once a respectable navy blue, was now torn and stained with soot and blood. The cold bit through the thin fabric, but she pressed on, driven by desperation and the hope that somewhere in this remote settlement she might find the answers her mother had promised. The main street was wider than she'd expected, lined with weathered wooden buildings that had seen better days. A saloon's batwing doors swung gently in the wind, spilling raucous laughter and the tinny sound of a piano into the night. Across the street, a general store sat dark and shuttered its windows, reflecting the flickering light from the saloon. But it was the building at the end of the street that drew her attention, an imposing structure with Marshal's office, painted in stark white letters across its front. Even in the darkness, she could see light burning in the windows and the silhouette of a man moving inside. As she approached, voices drifted from within. The first was deep and commanding, with an authority that seemed to fill the space around it. The second was higher, more nervous, the voice of someone who lived in fear. "You know the rules, Wheeler," the commanding voice said. "Every soul in Blackridge owes something. The question is whether you can pay." "Marshal Burke, I swear I'll have your money by week's end. The mine's been good to me lately, and the mine belongs to Blackridge. What it gives you is a privilege, not a right." The voice was silk over steel. "Besides, your debt isn't just financial, is it? There's the matter of your indiscretions." Annabelle crept closer, pressing herself against the wall beside the window. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see two men facing each other across a massive oak desk. The man behind the desk was tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his pale eyes. Those eyes. Her blood turned to ice. They were the same eyes that had watched her on the train, the mysterious passenger who had vanished in the flames. The other man. Wheeler was thin and nervous, his hands twisting a worn hat. "What do you want from me, Burke? I've paid everything you've asked." "Everything?" Burke's smile was predatory. "Because I distinctly recall you having a daughter. Pretty girl, about 18. She'd fetch a good price in Denver." Wheeler's face went white. "You can't. She's just a child." "Children grow up, Wheeler. And debts have a way of compounding." Burke leaned back in his chair, studying the trembling man with obvious satisfaction. "Of course, there are other ways to settle accounts. Information, for instance, or services rendered." Before Wheeler could respond, the door burst open. A woman strode in, tall, sturdy, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was weathered by years of hard work, but her eyes held a sharpness that suggested she missed nothing. "Marshal," she said curtly, "we've got trouble." Burke's expression didn't change. "Martha." "What kind of trouble?" "Train wreck about 3 miles up the pass. Looks like the whole thing went up in flames." Martha's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "Survivors are unlikely." Burke was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Send a search party at first light. We'll see what can be salvaged." "Already done. But there's something else?" Martha glanced at Wheeler, who seemed forgotten in the corner. "We found tracks leading down to town. Someone made it out." This time, Burke's composure slipped slightly. His pale eyes hardened. Find them. Annabelle's heart hammered against her ribs. She needed to get away from the window, but her legs felt like lead. The conversation inside continued, but she could barely hear it over the rushing sound of her own blood in her ears. Then a hand fell on her shoulder. She spun around, stifling a scream. A man stood behind her, tall, lean, with dark hair and kind eyes that seemed to glow in the starlight. He was younger than Burke, maybe 30, with the weathered hands of someone who worked the land. Easy, he whispered, his voice gentle but urgent. You don't want to be here. Before she could respond, he took her arm and guided her away from the marshal's office into the shadows between two buildings. She could smell wood smoke and leather on his clothes, and something else, the clean scent of pine and snow. Who are you? She managed to whisper. Cole Hartwell. I run a small ranch outside town. He studied her face in the dim light. And you're the survivor from the train. It wasn't a question. Annabelle nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look, torn, bloodied, half-frozen. How did you know? Martha's not wrong about much, and news travels fast in a place like this. He glanced back toward the marshal's office. You can't stay out here? It's too cold, and once Burke starts looking for you? Why would he look for me? I don't even know him. Cole's expression darkened. Burke looks for everyone eventually. This town has a way of collecting people. Once you're here, you belong to Blackridge, and Blackridge belongs to him. The words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What do you mean? Before Cole could answer, the door to the marshal's office opened. Martha emerged, followed by two men Annabelle hadn't seen before. One was massive, with arms like tree trunks, and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. The other was thin and sharp-featured, with the quick, nervous movements of a ferret. Spread out, Martha commanded. Check every building, every alley. Someone's out there and Burke wants them found. Cole pressed closer to the wall, pulling Annabelle with him. This way, he breathed in her ear. Stay quiet and stay close. They moved through the shadows, like ghosts, Cole, leading her through a maze of alleys and back streets she couldn't have navigated alone. Behind them, she could hear the search party spreading out their voices, echoing off the buildings. Finally, they reached a small building at the edge of town. It was modest, just a single story with a wraparound porch, but it looked warm and welcoming in a way that the rest of Blackridge did not. This is my place in town, Cole said quietly. I keep it for nights when the weather's too bad to make it back to the ranch. He led her inside and quickly lit a lamp, keeping the flame low. The interior was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of handmade furniture, and shelves lined with books. It felt like a sanctuary after the cold hostility of the street. Sit, Cole said, guiding her to a chair near the fireplace. I'll get the fire going and find you something warm to drink. As he worked, Annabelle watched his movements, efficient, careful, kind. He was nothing like the men she'd seen in the marshal's office. There was no calculation in his actions, no hidden agenda. Just genuine concern for a stranger in need. Why are you helping me? She asked. Cole paused in his fire building. When he looked up, his eyes held a sadness that seemed to go bone deep. Because I know what it's like to be alone in this place. And because... He hesitated. Because someone should have helped my sister when she needed it. Your sister, her name was Eleanor. She died 2 years ago. The words came out flat, emotionless, but Annabelle could hear the pain beneath them. Burke said she owed a debt. When she couldn't pay, he found other ways to collect. The fire caught, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the warm light, Cole's face looked haggard, older than his years. I tried to help her, but I was too late. I won't make that mistake again. Annabelle felt a pang of sympathy for this man, who'd shown her such kindness. But something about the name nagged at her. Eleanor. Why did that sound familiar? She pressed her hand to the locket beneath her dress, feeling its reassuring weight. Inside, along with Sarah's photograph, was a letter, one she'd never had the courage to read fully. Her mother's dying words had been so fragmented, so desperate. But the name Eleanor had been among them. "Eleanor Hartwell," she said softly. "That was your sister's name." Cole's head snapped up. "How do you—" Before he could finish the question, a sharp knock echoed through the room. They both froze, staring at the door. "Cole Hartwell," came Martha's voice from outside. "Open up. We know you're in there." Cole moved with practiced quiet, extinguishing the lamp and motioning for Annabelle to follow him toward the back of the house. But before they could reach the rear door, the front door splintered open. Martha stepped inside, flanked by the two men from the marshal's office. "That's not very neighborly, Cole," Martha said, her voice carrying a note of amusement. "Breaking down doors, I mean. Though I suppose you've had experience with unwelcome visitors." Cole stepped protectively in front of Annabelle. "What do you want, Martha?" "You know what I want. The girl from the train." Martha's eyes found Annabelle in the shadows. "There she is. Pretty little thing, isn't she? Burke's going to be very interested in meeting her. She's hurt and half frozen. At least let her rest." "Rest?" Martha laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, she'll have plenty of time to rest once Burke explains her situation. You see, miss," she addressed Annabelle directly, "everyone who comes to Blackridge owes something. It's just a matter of determining exactly what that something is." The larger of the two men, Martha had called him O'Malley, stepped forward. His voice was surprisingly gentle for such a massive man. "Come along, miss. No point in making this harder than it needs to be." Cole tensed, and for a moment, Annabelle thought he might fight. But then Martha made a small gesture, and the thin man Lenore drew a long knife from his belt. The blade gleamed in the firelight. "Now, Cole," Martha said reasonably, "we both know how this ends if you try to be a hero. Eleanor tried to be a hero, didn't she? Look how that worked out." The name hit Cole like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and the fight went out of him. "Don't hurt her," he said quietly. "Whatever Burke wants, it's not her fault she's here." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong," Martha replied. "Nothing happens in Blackridge by accident, Cole. You should know that by now." O'Malley moved past Cole and took Annabelle's arm, not roughly, but with unmistakable firmness. She thought about running, but where could she go? She didn't know the town. And the mountain wilderness beyond was a death sentence in winter. As they marched her toward the door, Cole caught her eye. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly. "About Eleanor." Martha's expression hardened. "That's enough. Lenore, if Mr. Hartwell says another word, encourage him to be quiet." The thin man smiled, running his thumb along the blade of his knife. "Be my pleasure." They walked through the dark streets of Blackridge in silence. The town felt different now, not just cold and unfriendly, but actively malevolent. Every shadow seemed to hide, watching eyes every doorway, a potential trap. Even the stars above seemed dimmer here, as if the very light was being drained away. The marshal's office loomed before them, its windows glowing with warm light that promised no comfort. Martha pushed open the door and gestured for Annabelle to enter. Marshal Burke sat behind his desk, exactly as she'd seen him before. Up close, he was even more imposing a man, accustomed to absolute authority, with the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of unchecked power. His pale eyes studied her with obvious interest. "So," he said, his voice silk over steel, "our mystery passenger, please sit down." It wasn't a request. O'Malley guided her to the chair across from Burke's desk, the same chair where Wheeler had sat twisting his hat in nervous hands. She wondered what had happened to the frightened man, and suspected she didn't want to know. "Your name?" Burke asked. "Annabelle Thorne." "Ah." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thorne. Now that's an interesting name. Tell me, Miss Thorne, what brings you to our little community? She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Something told her that any information she gave this man would be used against her. I was traveling west, looking for work. From where? Ohio. Family. Dead. Burke leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I see. No one to miss you then. No one to come looking. The words were delivered conversationally, but they carried an unmistakable threat. Annabelle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. What do you want from me? She asked. Want? Burke's smile widened. My dear girl, you have it backwards. The question is what you owe. You see that train ticket of yours? It was purchased with stolen money. That's impossible. I sold my family's farm to pay for the farm that was mortgaged to the Territorial Bank of Colorado. Burke opened a drawer and withdrew a folder thick with papers. The same bank that went under last year due to irregularities in its lending practices. He spread several documents across the desk. Even in the lamplight, she could see they were official-looking deeds, contracts, bank statements. Her own name appeared on several of them. According to these records, the sale of your farm was invalid. The bank had already foreclosed on the property and transferred ownership to its creditors. In other words, you sold something that wasn't yours to sell. Annabelle stared at the papers, her mind reeling. That can't be right. I received full payment. The buyer seemed legitimate. Oh, I'm sure he did. Confidence men often do. Burke gathered the papers and returned them to the folder. But legitimate or not, the fact remains you're in possession of funds that rightfully belong to someone else. In this case, those funds belong to Blackridge. How is that possible? The Territorial Bank's assets were purchased by a consortium of investors. Burke explained patiently. I represent those investors, which means your debt and you, by extension, now belong to me. The room seemed to close in around her. This was impossible, a nightmare that made no sense. But the papers looked real, and Burke's confidence was unshakable. I don't believe you, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Burke shrugged. Belief is irrelevant. The law is what matters, and the law is clear. You owe a debt, Miss Thorne. The question is how you intend to pay it. I don't have any money. I spent everything on the train ticket, and money is only one form of payment. Burke interrupted. There are others. Labor, for instance, or... His gaze traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Other services. Martha stepped forward from where she'd been standing silently by the door. Marshal, perhaps we should explain the girl's options more clearly. Of course. Burke opened another drawer and withdrew a leather-bound ledger. You see, Miss Thorne, Blackridge operates on a very simple principle. Everyone contributes according to their ability. Those who can work, work, those who can pay, pay, and those who can't. He let the sentence hang. He opened the ledger and ran his finger down a column of names. Wheeler, for instance. He works the mine and pays a percentage of his take. Mrs. Henley runs the boarding house and provides meals for my men. Rosa manages the saloon and keeps the customers happy. Each name he mentioned seemed to carry weight, as if these people were more prisoners than citizens. Annabelle thought of the frightened man she'd seen earlier, twisting his hat in nervous hands. What about those who refuse? She asked. Burke's smile turned cold. There's a cemetery on the hill behind town. You can ask them if you like. The threat was unmistakable. But something in Burke's manner suggested he was enjoying this too much, savoring her fear like fine wine. Men like him didn't just want compliance. They wanted submission. Absolute, complete surrender. You're not giving me a choice, are you? She said. Oh, but I am. Burke closed the ledger and leaned forward. You can work off your debt like everyone else. Of course, given the size of what you owe and the limited opportunities available to a woman in your circumstances, it might take quite some time. How long? 20 years, perhaps 30? The number hit her like a physical blow. By the time she paid off this fictional debt, she'd be an old woman if she survived it all. Or, Burke continued, there's another option. Tomorrow evening there's to be an auction. Various items of interest to the community. You could be one of those items. An auction. For your service contract, of course. Perfectly legal according to territorial law. The highest bidder would assume responsibility for your debt and for you. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. Annabelle felt as though she were drowning, pulled down by invisible weights. Everything she'd thought she knew about the world, about law and justice and human decency, was crumbling around her. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course. Burke's tone was magnanimous. Martha will see you to accommodations. The auction is tomorrow at sunset. I'll need your decision by then. As Martha moved to escort her out, Burke spoke again. Oh, and Miss Thorne. Don't think about running. The mountains are unforgiving in winter, and there's nowhere to go anyway. This is your home now. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be. Martha led her through the dark streets to a small building that served as the town's boarding house. It was a grim place, 2 stories of weathered wood with narrow windows that stared out like suspicious eyes. A painted sign over the door read, Henley's, in faded letters. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and unwashed bodies. A thin woman with graying hair emerged from the shadows, wiping her hands on a stained apron. Mrs. Henley, Martha said curtly. We have a new guest. She'll be staying in the back room. Mrs. Henley looked Annabelle up and down with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned to assess value quickly. How long? That depends on tomorrow's auction, Martha replied. Until then, she's not to leave the building. Understood? Mrs. Henley nodded. Course. Come along, girl. She led Annabelle up a narrow staircase to a small room at the back of the building. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto an alley filled with refuse. An iron bar ran across the window ostensibly to keep intruders out, but clearly serving another purpose. Meals are at 6 noon and 6, Mrs. Henley said. There's a chamber pot under the bed. Water comes from the pump in the courtyard, but you're not to go outside. She turned to leave, then paused. Bit of advice, girl. Don't fight what's coming. Burke always gets what he wants in the end, and fighting just makes it worse for everyone. With that cheerful thought, she left, closing the door behind her. Annabelle heard the distinct sound of a key turning in the lock. She was alone. The room felt like a tomb, cold, airless, suffocating. She sat on the narrow bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she'd been a free woman traveling west to start a new life. Now she was a prisoner facing the prospect of being sold like cattle. But was it real? Could Burke's papers be legitimate? The whole thing seemed too elaborate to be a simple confidence game, but too convenient to be coincidence. How could he have known she was coming? How could he have prepared all those documents? Unless she thought about the mysterious passenger on the train, the pale-eyed man who had watched her with such interest. The same man she'd seen in Burke's office. He had known her, somehow recognized her. But from where? Her hand went to the locket at her throat. It was still there, warm from her body heat. The one thing Burke hadn't taken from her, probably because he hadn't known it existed. Her fingers traced its familiar contours, the small silver heart engraved with roses, the delicate chain her mother had worn every day of her adult life. Inside were 2 items, Sarah's photograph and the letter. The letter she'd been too afraid to read, completely too overwhelmed by grief to face whatever secrets it might contain. But now, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to, perhaps it was time to confront whatever truth her mother had tried to pass on. She opened the locket with shaking fingers. Sarah's sweet face smiled up at her, frozen in eternal youth. But it was the letter that drew her attention, a small piece of paper folded so many times it was barely larger than a postage stamp. She unfolded it carefully, afraid it might crumble at her touch. Her mother's handwriting was cramped and hurried, as if she'd written it in great haste. But the words were clear enough. My dearest Annabelle, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are alone. I pray you never have need of what I'm about to tell you, but I fear the past will not stay buried forever. The locket is more than it appears. Behind Sarah's picture is a key turn twice to the right. What you find there will lead you to the truth about your father's death, about Eleanor, about Blackridge. Trust no one there except those who knew Eleanor. The man who calls himself Burke is dangerous beyond measure. But you are stronger than you know, child. You carry your father's blood, and he was the bravest man I ever knew. Find Cole Hartwell. He will help you if you tell him you knew Eleanor. Remember, the truth is the only weapon that can defeat lies. Your loving mother. Annabelle read the letter 3 times before its full meaning sank in. Her mother had known about Blackridge, about Burke, about Eleanor Hartwell Cole's sister, the woman who had died 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances. With trembling fingers, she removed Sarah's photograph from the locket. Sure enough, there was a tiny silver key, mounted behind it, no larger than a shirt button. She turned it twice to the right, as her mother had instructed. A section of the locket's back popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was another piece of paper, even smaller than the first. This one was covered in numbers, coordinates perhaps, or some kind of code. At the bottom, in her mother's careful handwriting, were 2 words, mining claim. Her mind raced. A mining claim. In Colorado territory that could be worth a fortune or nothing at all. But if it was valuable, it might explain Burke's interest in her. Maybe the debt was just an excuse to keep her here while he figured out how to get his hands on whatever her family might have owned. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly folded the papers and hid them in her dress. Who is it? Rosa Delgado. I brought you some food. The voice was warm with a slight Spanish accent. Annabelle heard the key turn in the lock, and the door opened to reveal a woman of perhaps 40, with kind dark eyes and graying black hair pulled back in a simple bun. She carried a tray with bread, cheese, and a cup of what smelled like coffee. I know you must be hungry, Rosa said, closing the door behind her, and frightened. She set the tray on the washstand and studied Annabelle with sympathetic eyes. I manage the saloon downstairs. Burke told me to keep an eye on you, but... She glanced at the door, then leaned closer. I knew Eleanor Hartwell. She was a good girl, and what happened to her was wrong. Annabelle's pulse quickened. What did happen to her? Rosa's expression darkened. Burke said she owed money. When she couldn't pay, he put her up for auction just like he's planning to do with you. An old man named Gideon won the bidding, a prospector who lived alone in the mountains. Eleanor tried to run away, but Burke's men brought her back. She paused, her hands twisting together. 3 days later, they found her body in the river. Burke said she'd tried to run again, fell through the ice. But Eleanor was a strong swimmer, and she knew these mountains better than most. The implication was clear. Eleanor hadn't drowned accidentally. She'd been murdered. Why are you telling me this? Annabelle asked. Because I have a daughter about your age. She lives in Denver with my sister, safely away from this place. But if she were here, if she were in your situation... Rosa's voice trailed off. Sometimes we have to take risks to do what's right. Annabelle felt a flicker of hope. Is there a way out of here, some way to escape before the auction? Rosa shook her head. Not alone. The mountains are too dangerous, and Burke has men watching all the roads. but there might be another way. She lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. Cole Hartwell is planning something. I don't know what, but he's been asking questions, making preparations. If you could get word to him. How? The saloon shares a wall with this building. There's a loose board on the 3rd floor near the back stairs. If you could get up there without Mrs. Henley seeing you. It was a slim chance, but it was something. Annabelle nodded. When? Tonight after midnight. Most of the customers will be gone by then, and Mrs. Henley sleeps like the dead. Rosa stood up, smoothing her skirts. But be careful. If Burke finds out I helped you. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what Burke did to people who crossed him. After Rosa left, Annabelle forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like sawdust in her mouth. She needed to keep her strength up for whatever came next. Then she sat by the barred window and watched the alley below, waiting for the town to settle into sleep. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. Finally, well after midnight, the sounds from the saloon below faded to silence. It was time. The boarding house's 3rd floor was a maze of narrow corridors and storage rooms that Mrs. Henley rented to transients. Annabelle moved through the darkness like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound on the worn wooden floors. Every creak of the old building made her heart skip, but she pressed on. She found the loose board exactly where Rosa had said it would be. It came away easily, revealing a gap just large enough for her to squeeze through. The saloon beyond was dark and quiet, smelling of tobacco smoke and spilled whiskey. She dropped down into what appeared to be a storage room, and then made her way carefully through the main room of the saloon. Tables and chairs loomed in the darkness like sleeping beasts. Behind the bar, bottles gleamed in the faint starlight, filtering through the windows. The back door was unlocked. Rosa had kept her word. Outside, the cold hit her like a physical blow. She'd grabbed her torn coat from the boarding house room, but it provided little protection against the mountain air. Snow crunched under her feet as she made her way through the alleys, staying away from the main street where Burke's men might be patrolling. Cole's house was dark, but a thin wisp of smoke from the chimney suggested someone was home. She crept onto the porch and tapped softly on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard footsteps inside, and the door opened a crack. Cole's face appeared in the gap, alert and wary. When he saw her, his expression changed to one of surprise and concern. What are you doing here? It's not safe. I know about Eleanor, she said quietly. I need to talk to you. His face went pale. Without another word, he opened the door and pulled her inside. The house was warm and dimly lit by the dying fire in the fireplace. Cole quickly stoked the flames, then turned to face her. How much do you know? He asked. I know Burke killed her. I know about the auction, about what he's planning to do to me. She pulled the letter from her dress. And I know my mother warned me about him. Cole read the letter by firelight, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked up at her with new understanding. Thorne, he said. Samuel Thorne was your father. She nodded. Did you know him? Eleanor did. She used to talk about him sometimes, said he was one of the few good men she'd ever met. Cole folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. He was a mining engineer, wasn't he? Came through Blackridge about 5 years ago? Yes. He was surveying claims for a group of investors back east. But he got sick and died before he could finish the work. That's not what Eleanor told me, Cole said quietly. According to her, your father found something. Something that scared him enough to try to leave town in the middle of the night. Annabelle felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. What did he find? I don't know for certain. But Eleanor said he'd discovered that most of the mining claims around Blackridge were fraudulent. That someone was selling the same claims to multiple buyers, taking their money, and then having them killed or driven off when they came to investigate. The implications were staggering. If Burke was running a mining claim fraud on that scale, he'd have to control the entire town to keep it secret. No wonder everyone seemed so afraid of him. My father tried to expose it. Eleanor thought so. She said he came to see her the night before he died, asked her to get a message to the territorial authorities. But he was dead by morning. Burke said it was pneumonia, but... You think Burke killed him? Cole nodded grimly. And when Eleanor started asking too many questions about it, he killed her too. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of these revelations. Then Annabelle remembered the hidden compartment in her locket. "There's something else," she said, showing him the coordinates. "My mother hid this in the locket. She called it a mining claim." Cole studied the numbers, his eyes widening. "These coordinates, they're for the old Silverbrook mine. It's been abandoned for years, but the claim is still legally valid. Is it worth anything? It could be. Your father did a survey of that mine before he died. If he found something valuable and somehow managed to file a legal claim..." Cole looked up at her with growing excitement. "This could be exactly what we need to bring Burke down." "How?" "If you're the legal owner of a valid mining claim, Burke can't touch you. Territorial law is very clear about property rights. But we'd need to prove the claim is legitimate, and we'd need to do it before tomorrow night's auction." Annabelle felt a surge of hope. "Where would the proof be?" "The Territorial Land Office in Denver. But that's 3 days' ride from here, and Burke would never let you leave." Cole stood up and began pacing. "Unless..." "What?" "Judge Morrison is coming to town tomorrow for the auction. He's the one who'll make it legal. If we could get the claim documents to him before the auction begins..." "Would he help us?" Cole's expression was uncertain. "Morrison's an honest man, but he's also careful. He won't act without solid proof. And Burke has a lot of influence with the territorial government." A new sound interrupted their conversation, the soft thud of footsteps on the porch outside. Cole's head snapped up his hand, moving instinctively toward a rifle mounted on the wall. "Someone's coming," he whispered. The footsteps were too light to be O'Malley, too confident to be Wheeler. That left only one possibility. "Martha," Cole breathed. A sharp knock echoed through the house. "Open up, Cole. We know she's in there." Cole looked at Annabelle with desperate eyes. "The back door," he whispered. "Go." But as they moved toward the rear of the house, another knock came from that direction. They were surrounded. "Cole Hartwell." Martha's voice called again. "You have 30 seconds to open this door before we break it down." Cole's shoulders sagged in defeat. "I'm sorry," he said to Annabelle. "I tried." He walked to the front door and opened it. Martha stood on the porch with Lenore and 2 other men Annabelle didn't recognize. All of them were armed. "That's better," Martha said, stepping inside. "Now, Miss Thorne, I believe you have somewhere to be." As they marched her back through the dark streets, Annabelle's mind raced. Tomorrow was the auction, her last chance to escape whatever fate Burke had planned for her. But now she knew the truth about her father's death, about Eleanor's murder, about the web of corruption that controlled this town. The question was whether that knowledge would be enough to save her, or if it would simply make her more dangerous to Burke and therefore more likely to end up like her father and Eleanor, dead. They locked her in the boarding house room and posted a guard outside the door. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving around, occasionally coughing or shifting in his chair. Any thought of escape was clearly impossible now. But as the hours passed and dawn approached, Annabelle found herself thinking not about escape, but about the truth. Her father had died trying to expose Burke's crimes. Eleanor had died asking the wrong questions. Now she was in the same position, with the same choice: stay silent and live as a slave, or speak up and risk everything. When Mrs. Henley brought her breakfast, the older woman's demeanor had changed. Instead of the resigned acceptance she'd shown before, there was something like sympathy in her eyes. "Heard you went visiting last night," Mrs. Henley said, setting down the tray. "Caused quite a stir." I needed to know the truth about what happened to Eleanor Hartwell. Mrs. Henley's hand stilled. That's dangerous talk, girl. More dangerous than being sold at auction. The older woman was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Eleanor was my niece. Her mother was my sister. Annabelle felt a jolt of surprise. She hadn't known about the family connection. She was a good girl. Mrs. Henley continued. Too good for this place, too honest. She saw what Burke was doing and thought she could fight it. Her voice turned bitter. She was wrong. What exactly did she know? Mrs. Henley glanced toward the door and then moved closer to the bed. She cleaned Burke's office, sometimes earned a few extra dollars. One night she found some papers documents about mining claims that had been sold multiple times to different people. Burke was taking money from investors back east, promising them claims that either didn't exist or were already owned by someone else. How much money? Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. Enough to set up a whole new life somewhere far away. Mrs. Henley's expression hardened. But Eleanor couldn't let it go. She started making copies of the documents, planning to take them to the authorities. What happened to the copies? I don't know. She hid them somewhere before she died. Cole's been looking for them ever since, but they've never turned up. Annabelle thought about this. If Eleanor had been smart enough to copy Burke's documents, she would have been smart enough to hide them well. But where? Did she have any special places, anywhere she felt safe? Mrs. Henley's eyes softened with memory. She loved the old mine shaft up on Prospect Hill. Used to go there when she needed to think. Said it was the only place in Blackridge where she could see the sky properly. Before Annabelle could respond, they heard heavy footsteps in the hallway outside. Mrs. Henley straightened up her face, resuming its usual mask of resignation. "Eat your breakfast," she said in a normal voice. "It's going to be a long day." The door opened and O'Malley filled the frame. "Burke wants to see her," he announced. Mrs. Henley nodded and left, without another word. O'Malley waited patiently while Annabelle finished her meal, then escorted her back to the marshal's office. Burke was dressed more formally than before, in a black suit that made him look like an undertaker. He was clearly preparing for something important, the auction, no doubt. "Miss Thorne," he said pleasantly, "I trust you slept well as can be expected for someone who's being held prisoner." Burke's smile didn't waver. "Prisoner is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of you as a guest whose departure has been postponed." He gestured for her to sit, then opened his ledger book. "I've been giving your situation some thought. The auction tonight should resolve your debt quite nicely, but I wanted to discuss the terms with you first." "What terms?" "Your cooperation primarily. The gentleman who wins the bidding will expect certain accommodations. Your attitude toward those expectations will determine how pleasant your future arrangements will be." The meaning was clear and utterly repugnant. Annabelle felt her stomach turn, but she forced herself to remain calm. "And if I refuse to cooperate, then you'll find yourself in the same situation as Eleanor Hartwell. Dead in the river with everyone in town believing you tried to escape." He said it so casually, as if he were discussing the weather. This was a man who had killed before and would kill again without the slightest remorse. "You killed my father too, didn't you?" she said. Burke's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his pale eyes. "Your father was a foolish man who didn't understand the realities of frontier life. He tried to interfere in matters that were none of his concern. He was trying to expose your crimes." "Crimes?" Burke laughed softly. "My dear girl, there are no crimes in Blackridge except the ones I define. I am the law here. I am justice, order, and civilization rolled into one. Your father forgot that fundamental truth, and it cost him his life." The casual admission of murder should have terrified her. But instead, Annabelle felt a cold anger settling in her chest. This man had destroyed her family, murdered innocent people, and turned an entire town into his personal kingdom of fear. Someone had to stop him. The territorial authorities will find out eventually, she said. You can't keep this up forever. Like, can't I? Burke leaned back in his chair. Judge Morrison arrives this afternoon to oversee tonight's auction. He's a respected member of the territorial government, and he'll certify that everything we do here is perfectly legal. After tonight, you'll be officially indentured to whoever buys your contract. Even if you somehow manage to escape, the law would be on their side, not yours. The hopelessness of her situation was crushing. Burke had thought of everything, planned for every contingency. She was trapped as surely as if she were in a cage. But then she remembered her mother's letter. You are stronger than you know, child. The truth is, the only weapon that can defeat lies. She still had the locket. She still had the coordinates. And somewhere in this town, Eleanor's evidence was waiting to be found. I want to see the town before the auction, she said suddenly. Burke raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon. If I'm going to spend the rest of my life here, I want to see what I'm getting into. Call it a condemned woman's last request. He studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of trick. Very well. Martha can give you a tour. But you'll be watched every moment, and any attempt to escape will end badly for you. I understand. Burke nodded to O'Malley, who left the office. A few minutes later, Martha appeared. The girl wants to see the town, Burke told her. Make sure she sees everything she needs to see. Martha's smile was predatory. Of course. Come along, Miss Thorne. Let me show you your new home. Martha's tour of Blackridge was designed to crush any remaining hope Annabelle might have harbored. They visited the mine where Wheeler worked bent double in the darkness, his face gaunt with exhaustion. They saw the boarding house where transients lived in squalid conditions, paying exorbitant rates for the privilege. They stopped by the general store where prices were so inflated that most residents could barely afford basic necessities. Everyone contributes, Martha explained as they walked. Everyone pays. Those who can't pay with money find other ways to be useful. They passed a small group of women working in a garden behind the saloon. Their faces were hollow, their movements mechanical. They looked like people who had given up long ago. What happens to them when they get too old to work? Annabelle asked. Martha shrugged. Accidents happen. People disappear. Life is hard in the mountains. As they reached the edge of town, Annabelle could see Prospect Hill rising in the distance. The old mine shaft Mrs. Henley had mentioned would be up there somewhere hidden among the trees and rocks. If Eleanor had hidden evidence there, it might still be waiting. What's up there? She asked, pointing toward the hill. Old mining claims, played out years ago. Nothing up there now but ghosts and memories. But Martha's tone suggested she was lying. There was something on that hill she didn't want Annabelle to see. As they walked back toward town, Annabelle noticed a man on horseback approaching from the south. He was well dressed with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. A badge glinted on his chest. Judge Morrison. Martha said, her voice taking on a respectful tone. Right on time. The judge was a man of perhaps 50 with silver hair and intelligent eyes. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a representative of law and order in a lawless territory. But as he drew closer, Annabelle noticed something that made her blood run cold. In his saddlebags, she could see the corner of a leather folder. The same kind of folder Burke kept his forged documents in. The same kind of folder that had supposedly contained proof of her debt. Judge Morrison wasn't here to ensure justice. He was part of Burke's operation. The judge dismounted and tipped his hat to Martha. Mrs. Patterson, I trust everything is ready for tonight's proceedings. Of course, Your Honor. Burke has all the paperwork prepared. Morrison's gaze shifted to Annabelle. And this would be the young lady in question. Annabelle Thorne, Martha replied. The one with the debt problem. I see. Morrison studied her with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. She looks healthy enough. Should fetch a good price. The casual cruelty of the comment was breathtaking. This wasn't a judge. It was another predator in expensive clothes. As Martha led her back to the boarding house, Annabelle's mind was racing. If Judge Morrison was corrupt, then appealing to his sense of justice would be useless. She needed to find Eleanor's evidence, and she needed to find it before the auction began. But how could she get to Prospect Hill with guards watching her every move? The answer came to her as they passed the saloon. Rosa was standing in the doorway, sweeping the front steps. When she saw Annabelle, her eyes conveyed a message: be ready. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, Annabelle heard the sounds of preparation from the street below. Men were setting up chairs in front of the marshal's office, creating an impromptu auction block. Lanterns were being lit, casting dancing shadows on the buildings. Her time was running out. Then she heard a commotion from the saloon below. Shouting the sound of breaking glass, men's voices raised in anger. A fight had broken out. Within minutes, she could hear her guard's footsteps hurrying down the stairs. Through the thin walls, she heard him talking to Mrs. Henley. I need to help break up the fight. Keep an eye on the girl. Of course, Mrs. Henley replied. But a few minutes later, Mrs. Henley's voice came from directly outside Annabelle's door. The fight's getting worse. Rosa needs help. I'll be back as soon as I can. The key clicked in the lock, but instead of the door opening, Annabelle heard footsteps moving away down the hall. Mrs. Henley had unlocked the door, but left it closed, giving her the opportunity she needed. She waited for the sounds from the saloon to reach their peak, then carefully opened the door. The hallway was empty. Moving as quietly as she could, she made her way to the back stairs and slipped out into the alley. The fight was still raging in the saloon. Rosa had done her job well. But Annabelle knew she didn't have long before someone noticed she was missing. She had to reach Prospect Hill and find Eleanor's hiding place before the alarm was raised. She ran through the darkness, using every shadow and alley to avoid being seen. The hill loomed ahead of her, dark and forbidding against the starlit sky. Somewhere up there was the truth that could bring down Burke's empire of fear, if she could find it in time. The old mine shaft was exactly where Mrs. Henley had said it would be, a dark opening in the hillside, partially concealed by scrub brush and fallen rocks. Annabelle approached it cautiously, every sense alert for danger. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, but it appeared to go back into the hill for some distance. She had no light source except the stars overhead, but she couldn't risk using the oil lamp she'd taken from the boarding house until she was well inside the tunnel. If someone was watching from the town below, even a brief flicker of light might give her away. The tunnel was cold and damp, with the musty smell of long abandonment. She felt her way along the rough stone walls, moving deeper into the hill. After what felt like forever, she judged she was far enough inside to risk lighting the lamp. The small flame revealed a narrow passage that extended further into the darkness. Along the walls, she could see the marks of pickaxes and shovels where miners had searched for precious metal decades ago. But there was something else, recent disturbances in the dust footprints that couldn't be more than a few years old. Eleanor had been here. Annabelle followed the footprints deeper into the mine. The passage branched several times, but Eleanor's trail was clear. She had taken the left fork, each time moving toward what appeared to be a natural cave at the back of the mine. The cave was larger than the tunnel, with a ceiling high enough that she could stand upright. The lamplight revealed something that made her heart race: a small wooden crate pushed back against the far wall, partially hidden by loose rocks. Inside the crate was a leather satchel, and inside the satchel was a treasure trove of evidence. Documents, letters, ledger pages, all in Eleanor's careful handwriting. She had been methodical in her investigation, copying everything she could find and organizing it in a way that told the complete story of Burke's criminal enterprise. There were records of fraudulent mining claims sold to investors as far away as New York and Boston. Letters from Burke to Confederates in Denver and Colorado Springs, arranging for the elimination of anyone who asked too many questions. a detailed account of how the territorial banking system was being manipulated to create false debts and legal justifications for enslaving people. And at the bottom of the satchel, a letter addressed to whoever finds this. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and if you are reading this, I am probably dead. For the past 6 months, I have been investigating a criminal conspiracy led by the man who calls himself Marshal Silas Burke. His real name is Silas Grimm, and he is wanted for murder and fraud in 3 territories. The evidence in this satchel proves that Burke Grimm has been running a mining claim fraud for at least 2 years, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from investors and murdering anyone who threatens to expose him. He has corrupted local officials, including Judge Morrison, and turned the town of Blackridge into his personal kingdom. I am leaving this evidence here because I believe Burke suspects what I've been doing. If something happens to me, I pray that someone will find this and take it to the territorial authorities in Denver. The people of Blackridge deserve justice, and the investors who were cheated deserve to know the truth. There is one thing more. A mining engineer named Samuel Thorne discovered Burke's crimes and tried to expose them. Burke had him killed, but before he died, Thorne managed to file a legitimate claim on the Silverbrook mine. His daughter Annabelle Thorne is the legal owner of that claim, and Burke cannot touch her as long as she can prove her ownership. Tell her that her father was a brave man who died trying to do the right thing. Tell her that the truth can still set us all free. Eleanor Hartwell. Annabelle read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor had died trying to save her, trying to save everyone in Blackridge. She had known about the Silverbrook claim, had understood its importance. But the most important revelation was Burke's real identity. Silas Grimm was a wanted criminal. If the territorial authorities knew he was in Blackridge, they would send a posse to arrest him immediately. She packed the evidence back into the satchel and prepared to leave the mine. But as she reached the tunnel entrance, she heard voices outside, multiple men moving through the darkness with purpose. "She's got to be up here somewhere," came Lenore's voice. Martha said she was asking about the hill. "Check every cave, every hiding place." O'Malley's deeper voice replied. "Burke wants her found before the auction starts." Annabelle extinguished her lamp and pressed herself against the wall of the tunnel. They were close, too close. If they found the mine entrance, she would be trapped. But then she heard another voice, one that made her heart skip with hope. "Over here." Cole's voice called from somewhere to the left. "I found something." The voices moved away from her position, following Cole's call. He was creating a distraction, giving her a chance to escape. But it was also putting himself in terrible danger. She waited until the voices faded into the distance, then crept out of the mine. The town below was ablaze with lanterns. The auction was about to begin. She could see people gathering in front of the marshal's office, a sea of faces in the flickering light. This was her chance. With Eleanor's evidence and her own legal claim to the Silverbrook mine, she could expose Burke's crimes in front of the entire town. But first, she had to get there without being caught. She ran down the hillside, the satchel clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind her, she could still hear the search party moving through the darkness, but they were heading in the wrong direction. Cole's ruse had worked. As she reached the edge of town, she could see the crowd gathering for the auction. Judge Morrison stood on a makeshift platform preparing to begin the proceedings. Burke was beside him, dressed in his finest clothes, every inch the respectable town marshal. But soon everyone would know the truth about Silas Grimm. The crowd was larger than Annabelle had expected. It seemed like the entire population of Blackridge had turned out for the auction, along with several men she didn't recognize, potential bidders from other towns, drawn by word of Burke's merchandise. She moved through the shadows at the edge of the crowd, looking for the best moment to make her move. Judge Morrison was speaking, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "Our ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here tonight to resolve a matter of legitimate debt. Miss Annabelle Thorne, through her own poor financial decisions, has incurred obligations that must be satisfied. In accordance with territorial law, her service contract will be auctioned to the highest bidder. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people looked uncomfortable with the proceedings, but no one spoke up. Fear had made them all complicit in Burke's crimes. "Bring forward the debtor," Morrison commanded. There was a moment of confusion as Burke's men realized their prisoner was missing. Martha appeared at Burke's side, whispering urgently in his ear. His face darkened with rage. "It seems our guest of honor has wandered off," he announced to the crowd. "But no matter. She'll be found soon enough, and the auction can proceed." But Annabelle had heard enough. Clutching Eleanor's satchel, she stepped out of the shadows and into the circle of lantern light. "I'm right here," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "And I have something to say." A gasp ran through the crowd. Burke's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he stopped himself. With so many witnesses present, he couldn't simply shoot her without consequences. "Miss Thorne," Judge Morrison said sternly, "you will remain silent while these proceedings are based on fraud." Annabelle interrupted, holding up the satchel. "And I can prove it." She opened the satchel and pulled out Eleanor's letter. "This is a letter from Eleanor Hartwell, written before she was murdered. It contains evidence of crimes committed by the man you know as Marshal Burke." Burke's facade of calm finally cracked. "That's enough," he snarled. "Lenore, arrest this woman for disturbing the peace." But Lenore hesitated, his hand hovering over his weapon. Something in Annabelle's words, or perhaps the mention of Eleanor's name, had given him pause. Eleanor Hartwell discovered that Burke's real name is Silas Grimm. Annabelle continued, her voice growing stronger. "He's wanted for murder and fraud in 3 territories. Everything he's done here, the false debts, the auctions, the murders, it's all part of a criminal conspiracy." Judge Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Young woman, you are making very serious accusations without proof." "I have proof," Annabelle replied, pulling out a handful of documents from the satchel. Bank records, correspondence, witness statements. Eleanor Hartwell documented everything before Burke had her killed. The crowd was stirring now, murmurs of shock and disbelief rippling through the assembled people. Some were looking at Burke with new suspicion, others at Judge Morrison. Furthermore, Annabelle continued, "I am the legal owner of the Silverbrook mining claim filed by my father Samuel Thorne before Burke murdered him. According to territorial law, no one can indenture the owner of a valid mining claim." She pulled out the coordinates from her locket and held them up. "These are the legal coordinates of my claim, hidden by my mother and confirmed by Eleanor's investigation." Burke could contain himself no longer. "Kill her," he roared at his men. "Kill her now." But something unexpected happened. Instead of drawing his weapon, Lenore stepped forward and placed himself between Burke and Annabelle. "No," he said quietly. "I won't kill another innocent woman." Burke's face was purple with rage. "You work for me, Lenore. You do what I tell you. I used to work for you." Lenore replied, his voice growing stronger. "But Eleanor Hartwell saved my life once when I was wounded and bleeding in an alley. She bandaged my wounds and asked for nothing in return. I promised her that if I ever had a chance to do something right, I would take it." He turned to face the crowd. "Everything this girl says is true. Burke is Silas Grimm, and he's been bleeding this town dry for years. Eleanor found out, and he had her killed. Same as he killed Samuel Thorne and God knows how many others." The crowd erupted in angry voices. People who had lived in fear for years suddenly saw a chance to fight back. But Burke wasn't finished. He drew his gun and pointed it directly at Annabelle. "You stupid girl," he snarled. "You think the truth matters. I own this town, I own these people, and I own you. Papers don't change anything." But before he could pull the trigger, A shot rang out from the darkness. Burke spun around, clutching his shoulder, his gun falling to the ground. Cole emerged from the shadows, rifle in hand. "You're wrong, Burke," he said quietly. "The truth changes everything." Judge Morrison was backing away from the platform, clearly trying to distance himself from the unfolding disaster. But the crowd had had enough of corrupt officials. "Or where do you think you're going, Judge?" called out Wheeler, the nervous little man from the mine. "You're part of this too, aren't you?" Morrison's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're in Eleanor's evidence," Annabelle said, pulling out another document. "Letters between you and Burke, arranging for false court orders and illegal auctions. You're as guilty as he is." The crowd pressed closer, their faces hard with years of suppressed anger. These were people who had been cheated, threatened, and terrorized. Now they had the truth, and they wanted justice. But Burke wasn't finished. Despite his wounded shoulder, he managed to grab a lantern from a nearby post and hurl it at the crowd. It shattered against the side of a building, and flames immediately began to spread. "If I can't have this town," he snarled, "no one can." Chaos erupted as people scattered to avoid the fire. In the confusion, Burke grabbed a horse and tried to escape, but Cole was ready for him. A second shot from the rifle brought Burke tumbling from the saddle. As the townspeople worked to put out the fire, Cole walked over to where Burke lay groaning in the street. The wanted man looked up at him with hate-filled eyes. "You think you've won," he gasped. "There are others like me. This won't change anything." "Maybe not," Cole replied. "But it changes everything for Blackridge." The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later with a posse of 6 men. By then, Burke was in custody, his wounds treated, but his spirit broken. Judge Morrison had already confessed to everything, hoping for leniency that would never come. Annabelle stood in the marshal's office, the same office where Burke had threatened her with a lifetime of slavery, and watched as the real lawman examined Eleanor's evidence. "This is remarkable work," Marshal Davies said, looking up from the documents. "Miss Hartwell was quite thorough. With this evidence, we can trace Burke's criminal network across 3 territories." "What will happen to the people who were cheated?" Annabelle asked. "We'll do what we can to make restitution. The territorial government has a fund for victims of fraud, and Burke's assets will be seized and liquidated." Davies closed the folder and looked at her with respect. "You did a brave thing, Miss Thorne. Not many people would have risked their lives to expose this kind of corruption." "I had help," she replied, glancing at Cole, who stood quietly by the window. "A lot of help." Over the following weeks, Blackridge began to change. Without Burke's oppressive presence, people started to speak freely for the first time in years. The fraudulent debts were canceled, the illegal contracts voided. Men like Wheeler could work for fair wages instead of subsistence, and women like Rosa could run their businesses without paying tribute to a criminal empire. But the changes weren't just legal, they were spiritual. The fear that had hung over the town like a shroud was finally lifting, replaced by something Blackridge hadn't seen in years' hope. Annabelle's mining claim proved to be legitimate and valuable. The Silverbrook mine contained a rich vein of silver ore that had been overlooked by earlier prospectors. With the proceeds from the mine, she was able to hire workers, purchase equipment, and establish herself as one of the territory's most successful independent miners. But perhaps more importantly, she used her resources to help rebuild Blackridge. She established a school, funded a real doctor to replace Burke's corrupt physician, and helped create a legitimate town government elected by the people. One evening, as spring began to warm the mountain air, she found herself walking through the town cemetery with Cole. They stopped at a simple grave marker that read, "Eleanor Hartwell. She died for the truth. She would have been proud of what you did." Cole said quietly. "What we did," Annabelle corrected. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, without Mrs. Henley, without Rosa. Eleanor brought us all together even after she was gone. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The peaks were still snow-capped, still imposing, but they no longer seemed like prison walls. They were just mountains, beautiful and eternal, marking the boundaries of a community that was finally free. "What will you do now?" Cole asked. Annabelle touched the locket at her throat, and the locket that had started it all. Inside, Sarah's photograph still smiled up at her, but the hidden compartment was empty now. Its secrets had been revealed, its purpose fulfilled. "I think I'll stay," she said. "Blackridge needs rebuilding, and I've got nowhere else to go." She paused, then looked at him with a slight smile. "Besides, someone needs to make sure the new town council doesn't get any ideas about becoming corrupt." Cole laughed, a sound she'd rarely heard from him, but one she hoped to hear more often. "I think you can handle that job." As they walked back toward town, Annabelle thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had come to Blackridge as a frightened, desperate refugee, carrying nothing but grief and a mysterious locket. She was leaving the cemetery as a successful businesswoman, a civic leader, and someone who had helped transform an entire community. Her mother had been right. The truth was the only weapon that could defeat lies. But it was also more than that. The truth was what allowed people to live with dignity, to build something worth preserving, to look toward the future, with hope instead of fear. The lights of Blackridge twinkled in the valley below, warm, welcoming lights that promised shelter and community. Tomorrow, there would be challenges to face, problems to solve, a town to continue rebuilding. But tonight, for the first time since her family had died, Annabelle felt truly at home. The locket rested against her heart, no longer heavy with secrets, but light with memories. Sarah's image would always be there, but now it was joined by new faces: Eleanor's courage, Cole's steadfast friendship, Rosa's quiet strength, Mrs. Henley's unexpected compassion. She had come to Blackridge looking for answers about the past. Instead, she had found something far more valuable, a future worth fighting for, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding the darkness, but from walking straight through it toward the light. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed her desperate flight from the burning train. Her imprisonment and near enslavement, her discovery of terrible truths, and her fight for justice. Now they looked down on a woman who had found her place in the world, in a town that was finally free to become what it was always meant to be. As she and Cole walked through the streets of New Blackridge, for that's what people were calling it, now Annabelle could hear the sounds of a community coming back to life. Laughter from the saloon, music from someone's parlor, the voices of children playing in the streets long after dark, because their parents no longer feared what might happen to them. It was the sound of hope, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Behind them, Eleanor's grave stood silent in the moonlight. But the town she had died to save was very much alive. And in that life, in that joy, in that hard-won freedom, Eleanor Hartwell had found her own form of immortality. The truth had indeed set them all free.